Okay, we're going to begin. My name is Stephen Schlossman. I'm professor of history and director of the undergraduate program in history at our department and at our university. And I want to welcome you here today. Before we start, may I ask for just a moment of silence in honor of the victims of massacre over the weekend. Thank you. In the spring of 2016, recognizing that maybe, just maybe, Mr. Donald Trump might shake up the political landscape, Donna Harsh, the head of the history department, and I decided to create 2 new history courses to enable students to bring focused historical insight to the 2016 presidential campaign and its aftermath. One course dealt with the traditions of American political campaigning, starting with Andrew Jackson. The other course dealt with the so-called first 100 days, starting with the presidency of George Washington. Though we had to resist some students' desire to make the course more about or even all about Mr. Trump, we never hesitated to adapt our curriculum to put history to direct use in illuminating the present. This is normal in our department's own history. From the time I arrived here 30 years ago, we have never hesitated to reinvent what we teach and how we teach it in order to address the contemporary moment. And that commitment continues this academic year in ways that, unfortunately and unpredictably, are particularly relevant at this truly tragic moment in our city's and nation's religious and political history. To be specific, either this semester or next, we are offering historical courses on such topics as Nazi ghettos, anti-Semitism in Europe, the place of refugees and asylum seekers within broader streams of global migration, and most succinctly, a course simply entitled Hitler. In that long tradition of integrating historical and contemporary inquiry, we are most fortunate in having with us today, as part of CMU's University Lecture Series, Ellen L. Weintraub, Vice Chair of the United States Federal Election Commission in Washington, D.C. Commissioner Weintraub has been a commissioner on the United States Federal Electoral Commission since 2002 and has served twice as its chair. During her tenure, she has been a consistent voice for meaningful campaign finance, law enforcement, and robust disclosure of money in politics. Current issues of concern to her are the prevalence of dark money, the potential for foreign interference, the role of social media, and barriers to every citizen voting in our elections. Prior to her appointment to the FEC, Commissioner Weintraub was counsel to the Ethics Committee for the U.S. House of Representatives. She has published articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and leading law reviews, and is a frequent speaker at conferences at home and abroad and on news shows including NPR and CNN. She hails from New York City and holds degrees from Yale College and Harvard Law School. The title of her ULS lecture is Money, Politics, and the Weaponization of the First Amendment. Before I turn it over to her, we know that the university is sponsoring a vigil in honor of the victims of the massacre this weekend, starting more or less at 5 o'clock in the University Center. Our goal is to complete the formal part of Commissioner Weintraub's talk around about 5:15, 5:20 perhaps, and then take a 5-minute break and enable those of you who want to go to the vigil and have time to get there. We think it'll be, the vigil will be still very much ongoing by the time you would get there. For those of you who would prefer to stay here after that 5-minute break, we'll have a question and answer session with Commissioner Weintraub. I now turn it over to Ellen Weintraub.
Thank you, Professor Schlossman. What he didn't tell you is that I have literally known this man since I was born. We both grew up in the same neighborhood in Queens. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you all coming. I know this is a difficult week here in Pittsburgh, and I want to apologize. I obviously chose the title of my talk weeks and weeks ago, and probably would not have used the word weaponization in the title had I known what was going to happen here. However, here we are. It is a phrase that has been used by the Supreme Court, and that's why I used it in my title. In June of this year, the Supreme Court handed down a case called Janus, affecting the right of public sector unions to collect agency fees from employees who are represented but don't agree with the union's political positions. And Justice Kagan wrote a very spirited dissent in which she said that the majority was overthrowing a decision that had been entrenched in this nation's law and its economic life for over 40 years. As a result, it prevents the American people, acting through their state and local officials, from making important choices about workplace governance. And it does so by weaponizing the First Amendment in a way that unleashes judges now and in the future to intervene in economic and regulatory policy. Almost all economic and regulatory policy affects or touches speech, so the majority's road runs long. And at every stop are black-robed judges, rulers, overriding citizens' choices. The First Amendment was meant for better things. It was meant not to undermine, but to protect democratic governance. So that's the theme of my talk here today. How the First Amendment, the pride and joy of our democracy, has been weaponized and used to undermine our democracy. Because I believe the court started down this road, not just with the Janus decision in June, but decades ago. But first, let's talk about money. Maybe some of you had never heard about the Federal Election Commission before I got here today and have no idea what we do, and that's okay. I'm not insulted. We regulate campaign finance at the federal level, money and politics. And if you think that sounds boring, think again. The money that is raised and spent to influence elections affects the policies made on every issue you care about, every issue that affects your life. Healthcare, immigration, the economy, the environment, criminal justice, taxes, the deficit, abortion, guns, student loans. So let's talk about all that money in politics. The Center for Responsive Politics predicts that $5 billion will be spent on the 2018 election, shattering previous records for midterm elections. Well, every election shatters the previous records on how much money was spent before. This one is a pretty big leap since the last midterm, only $3.8 billion was spent. So to go from 3.8 to 5 billion, that's a healthy increase. By the end of September, 2.2 million ad spots were run at a cost of nearly $1 billion for congressional and gubernatorial candidates, and that was up 70% from 2014. Outside group spending, that is not candidates, not party committees, went up by 85%. So this is a big year. Having said that, let's try and put it in a little bit of context. $5 billion is indeed a huge amount of money. However, the National Retail Federation predicts that on Halloween this year, we will spend $9 billion. And that is an awful lot of candy corn. And indeed, that $9 billion they predict will include $480 million on pets. So maybe we should step away from the Instagram and take a moment to think about some of our priorities here. Maybe we would be healthier as a nation if we spent less money on candy and even more on politics. So I don't personally believe that the overall amount, although everybody loves to write about it, and it always is a big ooh-ah moment when we announce how much money is raised and spent, I don't think the overall total is the appropriate thing to focus on. What I care about is how is this money being raised and spent? Is it being done legally? That's a good first question. Is it being done transparently? Is it being raised and spent in a way that gives rise to or mitigates the risk of corruption? Is it being raised and spent in a way that strengthens our democracy, that leads to an informed electorate where every person's vote counts and every person feels heard and represented? And that is where I think we have some problems. So where is all this money coming from? this $5 billion? Well, political committees have to disclose donors who give more than $200. So we have some information on that, and that is the information that my agency collects and makes public, and that good folks like the Center for Responsive Politics and Campaign Finance Institute and journalists dig into and do some great analyses for us. And I am indebted to groups like that for some of the summary figures that I'm going to be giving you here today. So far, more than 1 million people, almost 1.2 million people, have given more than $200. That's been disclosed so far in this cycle. That seems like a lot of people. That is 0.37% of the adult population, 0.37. So it's actually a very, very small number of people who give even $200 towards any campaign or political cause. On the top end, however, there are a few people who give a whole lot of money. 126 families have already given at least $1 million apiece. 10 donors, including 6 couples, have given more than $10 million apiece. And 1 lucky donor couple has given over $100 million. I think they're up to about $113 million now. And I wouldn't be surprised if by the time we get to the election, which is, over a week away, that we will see a couple of other folks top or come very close to that $100 million range. Who are these people? Who are these guys that are throwing around that much money in our politics? Well, they are, for the most part, I got to tell you, a bunch of old white guys. The top 10 super PAC donors include some of them are couples, some of them are singles. The singles are all men. The couples all include at least 1 man, the average age of whom is over 71. Super PACs, the big outside spending groups that do disclose their donors, have raised over $1 billion so far. And to give you a sense of the concentration of the money, the top 100 donors to super PACs have given over $600 million, roughly 71% of the total. The top 1% of donors, which is a little over 600 people, 638 people, have given over $800 million, or 92% of the total. So there is a small group of people who has given a whole lot of money towards our election this year, and that is just the money that we know about. A significant amount of the money spent on our elections is what we call dark money. That is money that is spent by groups that don't tell us who their donors are. As of October 24th, more than $730 million had been spent by outside groups. And then this again was a huge increase since 2014, the last midterm. And it's estimated that dark money groups have spent more than close to $133 million on the 2018 midterm so far. And again, that is a big increase from the last midterm cycle. Now, as I said, one of the things that I care about is it transparent? Do people know where the money is coming from? Because I think it's really important to know where the money is coming from. You can't really judge the messages that you're getting unless you know who's sending them to you. So the increase in dark money is, I think, a concerning factor. And because the sources of all this election spending are not entirely disclosed, there is an, in my view, unacceptable risk that foreign actors may be using dark money groups to influence our elections undetected. Because, of course, we don't know what we don't know. The groups that are spending without telling us, we don't know who's behind them or why they feel like keeping that a secret. Now, where's all this outside spending going? In this year's midterm elections, it is, and actually in every midterm election, it goes disproportionately to a few key races. Now, this year, and actually for the last number of years, people have been energized by the thought that one or the other House of Congress might change hands from one party control to the other party control. So there's usually a few key Senate races that everybody is zooming in on, and there's a surprising number of House races that are in play this year. But the money tends to focus on those races that look close and look like they could swing the balance. So, for example, in Minnesota, Senator Amy Klobuchar is running for re-election. She's leading in the polls last time I checked by about 20 points. So that race has attracted just $50,000 in outside spending. In contrast, In Missouri, where incumbent Senator Claire McCaskill is running against the state attorney general, Josh Hawley, and they are neck and neck, approximately $60 million has been spent already by outside groups, and that is more than the amount that the candidates themselves have raised, which is only about $38.5 million. Again, not a small amount of money, but the outside groups are dwarfing the spending by the candidates. And that really affects, again, how the races run, how you can assess the information that you're getting. Are the candidates getting drowned out by other people that are trying to position them on certain issues, or that may be misleading you about their positions because the information's not coming directly from a candidate. And to the extent that it's not coming from a group that's really accountable, that you can really figure out who they are, the claims, you have to be a little bit more skeptical of, because they don't have the same kind of discipline that a candidate might have who has to defend his or her own reputation when they're talking and when they're running their ads. They are ultimately accountable, and you know who they are. If there is some group called Americans for Apple Pie and Mom who is running ads, there may not be any mom behind that group at all. For all you know, it's one of those 71-year-old white guys. And, the moms aren't even involved. So I would counsel increased skepticism on any ad that you cannot trace back to somebody that you can identify. Because, why are these people trying to hide who they are when they're trying to influence your vote? Now, how did we get to this interesting situation where there's all this outside spending and some of it is disclosed and some of it isn't disclosed? Well, you have to go back to the First Amendment. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And it protects a bunch of other good stuff too. Now, let me say at this moment that we should all, at your Thanksgiving table next month, we should all say a little bit of a prayer for Thanksgiving, that we are grateful to be living in a country where we have a First Amendment that protects our freedom of speech. We have seen very recently some hard evidence that in some countries it is very dangerous to be a dissenter, to criticize your government. And for all of the foibles and criticisms that we may have of the way our system runs here, at least we live in a place where you can stand up on any street corner, buy any ad, criticize the government, speak truth to power without fear that the military is going to come into your house at night and spirit you away. And there are sadly places where that is not true. So whatever else I say about the First Amendment and how it has been construed by the Supreme Court, do not doubt for 1 minute that I am really grateful and feel blessed to live in a country that has that kind of legal protection written right into the Constitution. Now, the Supreme Court, when they interpret the First Amendment, that when they want to protect our freedom of speech, they are particularly protective of political speech, and they view the money that is spent to get your political message out as protected under the First Amendment. When the campaign finance laws were for the first time comprehensively written in the 1970s, the court had to rule on them in the landmark case of Buckley v. Vallejo, 1976, and they upheld contribution limits to candidates and party committees as necessary to deal with the reality or appearance of corruption inherent in a system permitting unlimited financial contributions. But they struck down expenditure limits because they impose a direct and substantial restraint on the quantity of political speech in the view of the court. Now, the court also said that the concept that government may restrict the speech of some elements of our society in order to enhance the relative voice of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment, which was designed to secure the widest possible dissemination of information from diverse and antagonistic sources and to assure unfettered interchange of ideas for the bringing about of political and social changes desired by the people. It is not, they said in another case, an acceptable governmental objective to level the playing field or to level electoral opportunities or to equalize the financial resources of candidates. Now, that's kind of an interesting point of view from judges who like to describe themselves as umpires calling balls and strikes. When was the last time you saw an umpire who actually celebrated the notion of an unlevel playing field? But that is how our courts view it. They think it's we're discriminating against rich people if we don't let them spend as much money as they want on politics. Now, this is not the only way that one might go about trying to assure the unfettered discussion of issues of public import. The Canadian Supreme Court, just to give you a point of comparison, has looked at a set of expenditure limits and upheld them in Canada, also trying to promote great discussion in their country. They say, the overarching objective of the spending limits is electoral fairness. This egalitarian model of elections seeks to create a level playing field for those who wish to engage in the electoral discourse, enabling voters to be better informed. The right of meaningful participation in the electoral process is not limited to the selection of elected representatives and includes a citizen's right to exercise his or her vote in an informed manner. In the absence of spending limits, it is possible for the affluent or a number of persons pooling their resources and acting in concert to dominate the political discourse, depriving their opponents of a reasonable opportunity to speak and be heard, and undermining the voters' ability to be adequately informed of all views. So here we have two courts right next door to each other, neighboring countries, similar legal and historical backgrounds, and they come to the exact opposite conclusion about how we can best protect informed discourse and the most robust discussion of ideas in our political debate. And I think it's interesting to look at that because it's good to know that there's not only one way of looking at these issues. When I read about the courts, and you'll see where my biases are if you haven't already cleaned them, when I see the courts being so protective of the rights of the very wealthy to spend unlimited amounts of money to try and influence our politics, I always wonder, how meaningful that right is that they are being so assiduous to protect. Because the right to spend an unlimited amount of money is only meaningful if you have unlimited amounts to spend. Now, there are some people who do, as I described earlier, but, not all of us do. And it kind of reminds me of the great line by Anatole France, the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. The way the laws that appear to be neutral affect people depending on their resources, sometimes the impact of that is not so equal. So if the court upheld contribution limits and said that there's an inherent risk of corruption in unlimited money flowing to politicians, how do we end up with these super PACs that are collecting millions of dollars of contributions from these very wealthy people? Well, that is a result of a more recent development, the Citizens United case in 2010 and its progeny, and where the court basically took the position that, for one thing, corporations and presumably labor organizations similarly had the right to express their views on politics as well, and that and emphasized a decision that was really started in the Buckley decision in 1976, that independent spending can't be corrupting. So they view corruption as the only possible rationale for limiting contributions to candidates, and they think that you can only be corrupted by what they call a quid pro quo relationship, where somebody offers you money and then you do something in return for that. Now, if the money's going to an independent spending group, that, in the view of the court, cannot possibly be corrupting as a matter of law. They've just declared it. Now, I ask you if this makes any sense, that given that the current contribution limit is $2,700 from any one individual to any one candidate in any one election, if a $3,000 contribution is illegal, you can be punished for giving that much money directly to a candidate's campaign committee, because there is an inherent risk of corruption in that massive $3,000 contribution. How can it be true that a $3 million contribution going to a super PAC that is doing nothing but promoting the election of that very same candidate, how can that have no risk of corruption? And it gets worse with the dark money groups, because they are dark only to us. The candidates themselves, they know where the money is coming from. There is no law that says that the donors to the dark money groups can't call up the candidates and say, oh, by the way, Joe, I want you to know I gave a few $1 million to that super PAC that's, or that dark money group that is running ads on your behalf. Just want you to know, next time I need a favor or I've got a point of view I want to express on the issues of the day, I just thought you might like to know that I'm a big supporter. It's interesting, the Chief Justice, Justice Roberts, in the Williams-Yulee case, a case about judicial races, actually encouraged politicians to be responsive to their big donors. He wrote, politicians are expected to be appropriately responsive to the preferences of their supporters. Indeed, such responsiveness is key to the very concept of self-governance through elected officials. And I thought that politicians were supposed to be responsive to their constituents, the people they actually represent in our system of representative government. Just another point of view. Now, with all this going on, the very wealthy have a disproportionate ability to influence not only who gets elected, but the policies that get adopted by the candidates once they get into office. And the First Amendment is the primary basis for the court's reasoning that this system has to work the way it does. But it's interesting because the First Amendment didn't used to work that way. The First Amendment used to be the thing that protected unpopular, disadvantaged people from being punished for expressing their views. If you were one of the underclass, if you were somebody who was in a fringe position and you wanted to express an unpopular point of view, the First Amendment is the thing that protected you. It was the thing that protected civil rights demonstrators. It was the thing that prevented suppression of labor picketing in the 30s and 40s when individual laborers had very little influence to affect labor policies that were adopted by their employers, who had in the marketplace a lot more power, and it was the First Amendment that protected them. But today, things are different, and over the last number of decades, things have become more difficult. As Professor Louis Seidman of Georgetown has observed, instead of providing a shield for the powerless, the First Amendment has become a sword used by people at the apex of the American hierarchy of power. And is that really what we need a First Amendment for? So, that's one problem. But there are more problems with the way this works, because there's another way that the First Amendment has been weaponized, is being used against us, and that is by foreign individuals and governments who are trying to influence our politics. And this is, I think, even more serious than, if you're worried about rich guys who are trying to change government policies to their benefit, how much more concerned should we be about foreign actors who really do not have the best interests of this country at heart? It's illegal, of course, for foreigners to spend money in connection with our elections, but foreign governments, particularly those who do not have strong protections for freedom of speech in their countries, are trying to use our strength against us. It's a great martial art move, right? So you use the strength of your opponent against them. We have this great, robust free speech protections in our country, and they are trying to use that against us. In February of this year, Special Counsel Robert Mueller indicted 13 Russians and 3 Russian entities for engaging in a wide-ranging, multi-million-dollar conspiracy to, quote, interfere with U.S. political and electoral processes, including the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Also in February, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates told the Senate Intelligence Panel, there should be no doubt that Russia perceives its past efforts as successful and views the 2018 U.S. midterm elections as a potential target. In July, he reiterated the warning lights are blinking red. And just 10 days ago, the Department of Justice handed down a further complaint demonstrating that the Russians continue to spend tens of millions of dollars to, quote, sow discord in the U.S. political system and to undermine faith in our democratic institutions. Now, sometimes this is described as meddling. You will hear this in the media. The Russians are meddling in our elections. Bad Russians, stop meddling. You know, meddling is when you're out with your unruly toddler and some stranger comes up to you and tries to give you parenting advice. It's when your neighbor leans across the fence and tells you that they don't like the way that you're mowing your lawn. This is not meddling. What the Russians are doing and what other countries are starting to do as well, because they saw it work the last time, so I think we have to anticipate that, you know, other folks who similarly do not have our best interests at heart are going to try and play the same games this time. This isn't meddling, this is information warfare. This is serious business, and they are trying to set us against each other. Now, no one wants to get their news from a Russian troll farm. So we all need to be savvier about where we're getting our information. In the 2016 election, Facebook finally confessed. At first they said there was really very little spending, but then they finally confessed that ads that were placed by the Russians were seen by 146 million people in this country. About 126 million on Facebook and another 20 million on Instagram. And you want to know how many people voted in the 2016 election? 137 million. So more people, now I don't know if it was exactly the same people, but more people saw those ads than actually the number of people who voted. So this isn't a small effort. This isn't, this involved millions of dollars. It continues to involve millions of dollars, and we all need to be very careful about what we are consuming. When you look at something online, you know, it might have been forwarded to you by a friend, but you need to look behind that and see, you know, how many times have we seen something on social media that is somebody sharing something that, you know, some other person that, you know, you don't know who that person is, but boy, I agree with that sentiment. That's a catchy slogan that somebody came up with that's now becoming a viral meme. Sorry. And we have to be really careful about where we're getting our information and what we're believing, because not everything out there is true, and even the things that sound right to us are sometimes being placed by people who have really bad motives and are trying to set us against each other. And unfortunately, there are also people inside our country who are trying to set Americans against Americans and trying to come up with these very provocative messages that is leading to greater and greater polarization in this country. It's not the only cause, but it is certainly a cause. And I think we just have to be wary of that, because that is not in our interests for us to be constantly fighting with each other. We need to do a better job of trying to listen to each other and to hear each other and to not demonize each other and not to try and assume that anybody who doesn't agree with us is a terrible, evil person. Because it's taking us, I think, to a bad place where it's getting harder and harder for people to get together and form consensus or even agree on what the facts are. This is a university. You guys should live in a fact-based world, and there's a lot of stuff out there that just isn't true. So, what are we going to do about all this? Well, at the federal level, there have been some good bills proposed in Congress. They're not moving very quickly, but there are smart people in Washington who are thinking hard about how to address some of these issues. And in the meantime, there are states and localities that are working to try and come up with better ideas on how to do money in politics. New York City, for example, has long had a very vibrant public financing system. I think they're up to something like a 6-to-1 match, and they may be on small donations, and they may be looking to even increase that. Seattle has come up with a very interesting idea about democracy vouchers, where they have given each person in Seattle for $25 vouchers that they can provide to the candidates of their choice for local elections. And what this has done, and it seems to be pretty successful, is that it has provided new motivation for candidates to reach out to communities that they were ignoring before because maybe they weren't high turnout neighborhoods and they didn't have much resources in the money and politics sphere, so there wasn't much reason for candidates to go there and try and get the support of those people. But now everybody's got those $425 vouchers and everyone becomes a more valuable constituent and somebody who is worth reaching out to and listening to. In St. Petersburg, they are trying to adopt proposals to limit the influence of super PACs and also to limit the influence of corporations that are funded with money that is coming from foreign sources. You know, a lot of the corporations in this country, even the straight up business corporations, have a great deal of stock ownership that is owned by foreigners. So you have to think about if you have a company that is wholly or largely or significantly owned by foreigners, what is going to be the interest of that corporation when they are spending money in our elections? What kind of policies are they going to be trying to promote? And are those policies in the interest of their foreign owners or in the interest of American citizens? You know, it's worth asking about. Okay, so in addition to what's going on at the local level, what you all want to know is what can you do to address some of these big problems? And you know what? You guys have a superpower. You can really change the world. And you know what it is? You need to vote. You need to get your friends out to vote. You need to reach out to everyone in your greater community to vote, because voting really matters. In the 2016 election, there were roughly the same number of millennials as baby boomers, but there were 14 million more baby boomers who voted. 14 million. Imagine if that many more millennials voted, could have changed the complexion of every single election. In the 2014 election, which was the lowest turnout in 70 years, you have to go back to World War II era, where half of the electorate was abroad fighting for democracy, to find a lower voter turnout. People over the age of 60, 55% of them voted. People between 18 and 29, 16%, 1/6 voted. So, and that has consequences. People think midterms don't matter. Well, in the midterm election of 2014, the control of the Senate turned over. So when Barack Obama nominated Merrick Garland, Mitch McConnell was the leader of the Senate and was in a position to deny Merrick Garland a hearing or a vote on that nomination to the Supreme Court. Now, you may think that that is a great result, or you might think that it is a terrible result, but either way, it is certainly a consequential result. And it happened as a result of people who were elected with a very small number of people voting, the lowest, as I said, in 70 years. Midterms matter. They matter this year in particular because we're heading into the decennial redistricting and the census, and the people who are elected at the state level are going to have a say in that. And if you think your vote won't change the result, then think about this. Even if you live in a solid red or blue district and there is no way that you think that your vote is going to matter, let me tell you something. Politicians watch who votes. They know who they need to be responsive to, because even though they are responsive to their big donors, they also are responsive to things that they think are going to get them unelected. And masses of voters makes a difference to them. And this is why Social Security is the third rail of politics, and student loan debt is not, because politicians believe that young people will not hold them accountable in the only way that they care about, by turning them out of office if they don't do something about the issues that young people care about. And by the way, a small number of voters actually can make a difference in elections. And you think it never matters, but it does. If you don't think it matters, ask Shelley Simons. She was a candidate for a seat in the Virginia state legislature earlier this year. In that election, after about 23,000 votes were cast, she and her opponent were tied, with control of the state legislature hanging in the balance. And they had to pull names out of a hat. They had to pull a name out of a hat, and she lost. It wasn't her name that came out of a hat. One more person voting could have made the difference. And famously, in the Bush v. Gore race in 2000, although more than 100 million votes were cast, it came down to 537 votes in the state of Florida. So there are definitely elections where just a small number of votes can matter. And you know what? Politicians know that. and some of them are running scared. And we are seeing some really, I think, unfortunate and dismaying evidence that politicians are trying to choose their electorate rather than having the electorate choose the politicians. We are seeing an uptick in measures that I really have to describe as voter suppression. So, and if you think this doesn't affect you, let me tell you, some of them specifically target students. In 34 states, there's some form of in-person voter ID and that is required in order to vote. And in 6 of those states, they don't accept student ID cards. That's not an accident. They're trying to minimize the number of students, of young people who vote. One of these states is North Carolina. In North Carolina, by the way, now the predicate for all of this is voter fraud. And I almost don't even want to get started on the subject of voter fraud because it makes me really mad. The fraud is the people who are being prevented from voting because other people are claiming that there is non-existent voter fraud. It is infinitesimal that people actually show up to the polls and pretend to be somebody else in order to cast one vote for, or one extra vote in that election. And of course, it wouldn't really make sense for anybody to do that because you risk going to jail. I mean, really, you'd have to organize a massive number of people in order to swing an election, you know, in most cases, because, you know, most cases don't actually come down to the one vote. So you'd have to get a whole lot of people who agreed to risk going to jail, each one of them to change one vote in order to add one more vote to the total. Who's going to do that? Well, it turns out when they start looking for evidence, they can't find evidence that anybody's going to do that. They looked in Kansas in a case recently, and the Secretary of State there, who was also running for governor, and insisted that there was, you know, okay, he could only come up with a few instances, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. And the judge said, nah, your iceberg looks more like an icicle. There is really no evidence that this is happening in any significant numbers. And this has been shown in a number of state courts that have looked at this issue. There are a number of studies that have looked at this issue. The Nonpartisan Brennan Center from New York looked at this. Arizona State did a study on this. Justin Levitt, who is a professor out in California, who I think has had some dealings in this state also, looked at every race between 2000 and 2014 to look for any credible allegation of voter impersonation fraud, and he came up with 31 instances out of 1 billion votes cast. But these kinds of voting restrictions that ask for voter IDs and other kinds of limits in order to combat voter fraud, they have a real impact on other people and whether they are allowed to vote. So I think let's see where I got this from. I think this is from the ACLU, has stated that up to 11% of American citizens lack a government-issued photo ID. And not surprisingly, that is disproportionately made up of low-income, racial and ethnic minorities, the elderly, and people with disabilities. In 2012, right here in Pennsylvania, they tried to require a photo ID. And they disallowed welfare cards and school district employee cards and college IDs without an expiration date. Now, some experts estimated that that would have disenfranchised at least 9% of the population in Pennsylvania, again, disproportionately people of color. But in January 2014, a Pennsylvania state court held that the law violated the Pennsylvania Constitution because it unreasonably burdened the right to vote. At the trial, the state conceded that there were no recorded reports of investigations into or prosecutions for voter impersonation anywhere in the state. In North Carolina, getting back to North Carolina, after 2008, North Carolina state government revised their voter ID law to exclude student ID cards and implement other measures that seemed to be designed to depress voter turnout. And in 2016, a court struck it down, federal appellate court, holding that the new provisions targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision and imposed cures for problems that did not exist. Nevertheless, the North Carolina is now attempting to amend its state constitution to require voter IDs. This is going on in states throughout the country. It's in part because of a decision of the Supreme Court to knock down a provision of the Voting Rights Act that used to force states in particular jurisdictions to go and get permission from the Department of Justice if they were going to change the voting rules in ways that might disproportionately affect people who had been historically discriminated. And that no longer exists because the Supreme Court thought, hey, we don't have discrimination anymore. We don't have to worry about that. It does not appear to be true. There are new laws. There was a new law passed in North Dakota, which has a substantial Native American population. Many of them live on reservations where they don't have street addresses. They use P.O. boxes. Guess what? The new ID law says you can't use an ID that doesn't have a street address. P.O. boxes don't count. Now, the North Dakota Senate race, which is one of the hot races this year, the last 6 years ago, that race came down to a 3,000 vote margin, and there are supposedly at least 5,000 Native Americans who don't have the proper ID. There's a city in Kansas called Dodge City that has a heavy Latino population where they moved, there are 27,000 people who live there. They moved the only polling station outside of the city limits, and it's a mile away from the nearest bus stop. So that wasn't designed to make it harder for people to vote. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on that is really disturbing, particularly in light of our history in this country, of the way we have treated certain populations, notably Native Americans, African Americans, and it is truly disturbing to me that there are people out there who would do anything to make it harder for these populations to vote. I think everybody who is a legal citizen in this country should be able to vote and should be encouraged to vote. We will have a stronger democracy as a result of it. It will be a more representative democracy. So here we are in this place where we have billionaires with huge megaphones. Never before have so few given so much and acquired such backroom influence. We've got people who are trying to stop people from voting. Given the parameters laid down by the Congress and the Supreme Court, how do we ensure a just and robust democracy? In a system where spending is speech and money talks, who has a voice? Who is empowered? Who speaks for the single mom trying to find decent childcare so she can go to work and support her family? Who speaks for veterans who come home from war zones and can't get decent medical care? Who speaks for people with pre-existing medical conditions, the cost of which could bankrupt the entire family if they lose their health insurance? Who speaks for young people who work hard to graduate only to emerge buried in debt that limits their choices for where to work and where to live? Who speaks for children and old people shot down in their schools and their places of worship? In a system where money is speech, who has the incentive and the means to participate, to change policy, to be represented? Whose interest does our representative democracy represent? The few or the many? Politics is not just about money. Take charge of your country. Take charge of the state of our nation. Vote for people who will stand up against hate and hold them accountable. Vote as if your democracy depends upon it, because it surely does.
So this was wonderful talk. Thank you very much for being here. I have so many questions, but I'll start with this one. So you mentioned that St. Petersburg is actually doing something to limit PAC influence. Can you talk a little more about that, and is that something that can be done statewide or nationwide?
Well, everybody's got elections, right? So there are federal elections, and then there are state elections, and then there are local elections, and St. Petersburg is in the vanguard of an effort to try and limit the influence of super PACs. They're trying to, honestly, I think part of this was started back in that golden era where people thought that maybe there was the prospect of a different kind of majority on the Supreme Court that might be amenable to reeling in Citizens United. So they were trying to set up a challenge to super PACs, which have never been formally discussed by the Supreme Court. That's the existence of super PACs depends on a DC Circuit opinion. So there's that piece of it. And then there's another piece that actually I'm kind of proud of. It arises out of an op-ed that I wrote in the New York Times in 2016 suggesting that we could look more closely at where corporate money, who are the real owners of corporate money. You know, in the Hobby Lobby case, for example, the Supreme Court said, well, you know, this corporation has can assert a religious viewpoint because it's not really the corporation's religious viewpoint. Corporations don't have an opinion, but the people behind them do. The owners, the shareholders, the management, they have opinions and their views matter, and the fact that they are acting through a corporation doesn't mean that you get to take away their First Amendment rights. Well, okay, good, let's work with that. If we're going to look to the owners of corporations, a lot of them are foreigners. And there are laws that we could look at in the communications sphere and in the security sphere that look to what it takes to control a corporation. In the communications sphere, you can't get a broadcast license if you have more than 20% foreign ownership. In the SEC context, the securities context, it's considered a significant and disclosable event if somebody owns 5% of the stock. So if we think that that much ownership actually can influence the decisions of the corporation, then maybe we should look at who owns the stock. You know, one of the points that I didn't quite elaborate on because I was watching the clock and I wanted to respect the people who wanted to get a chance to leave, is the difference between the way the Supreme Court looked at corporate and union dissenters. So in the Citizens United case, the point was raised that, well, you know, some of the shareholders of these corporations might not agree with the management and might not want, you know, their share of the corporate money going towards supporting this particular political view. And the court was pretty dismissive of that and said, well, you know, there are institutions of corporate democracy. There are ways that shareholders can try and get their views known. I mean, you know, if you're a single shareholder, how in the world are you going to influence what GM does or you know, IBM or Microsoft or whatever? You know, it's not terribly practical, but the court was persuaded that it was good enough. But then in the recent Janus case, when they were looking at the issue of a union member who might have dissenting views from the union, well, there are institutions of union democracy as well, but the court just didn't think those were adequate. They were not willing to allow a single union member to have to be forced to support the union point of view. It starts to look a little bit like content discrimination, that, you know, the court is just more protective of certain points of views than others. So, you know, to the extent that localities adopt more innovative measures, they can, you know, sometimes things started as a groundswell at the local level. So enough localities and states adopt something, and then it can filter up to the federal level and develop a momentum of its own. And in any event, you know, people can start close to home and try and make better government in the places where they live.
You had a...
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here today. A very insightful speech. But earlier you touched upon the need for media literacy, particularly for online mediums.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any role for the FTC to intervene, especially on these mediums such as Facebook and Twitter? There are outlets that are putting out very political speech that is often very incorrect and can even often stoke flames of hatred and division, especially internal, putting aside the external media that's been coming in from foreign countries. But do you believe that there's any role for the FTC to intervene in that, and if so, what would that be?
Well, I think the role that we have is in trying to make sure that the information is properly disclosed and has appropriate disclaimers on it so that people can see where the information is coming from. I think there would be a lot of hesitation from a lot of people across the political spectrum with trying to have somebody designated as the truth police, who was, you know, I mean, really, I do a great job at that, but you know, you maybe don't want to give me that kind of power to decide what's true and what's not. And I can not begin to imagine how that would go on the current FEC, you know, which is by law evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, and you know, how we would ever come to agreement on what's true and what's fake news. I think the best we could do is to try and get you better information about where the information is coming from. We actually have an ongoing rulemaking right now, which just takes on a little itty-bitty piece of this. I've been throwing out proposals for years now of different ways of addressing this, and I finally got them to agree to start a rulemaking that just addresses disclaimers on digital ads that include express advocacy, you know, direct appeals to vote for or against a candidate. And even that is proving to be somewhat difficult to get to the finish line, because one of my colleagues is very concerned that, you know, what if somebody wants to run a really itty-bitty ad and they don't have room for a disclaimer? We really need to have some kind of exception for that. And my concern is that if whatever exception we create will suddenly become the norm, because there are people who really want to avoid disclosure. So if you give them a venue for doing that, whole new platforms will be created right around our exception, and it will end up swallowing the rule. But you know, we continue to plug away at that.
Hi there. Thank you for coming this evening. My question is about the Janus versus American Federation case you mentioned.
Excuse me, can everybody hear? Okay.
Yeah, so just a moment ago you kind of distinguished between Citizens United and Janus in regards to the Supreme Court's apparently disparate treatment of them. I guess I would personally distinguish it because the corporation there was a fully private entity, whereas at Janus you had a government body involved that was requiring this membership. But my question is, how, from a constitutional standpoint, can you distinguish the respondents' arguments in Janus that these people should be compelled to pay a union agency fee? How do you distinguish that against a situation where, for example, they were required to pay similar dues to a more openly partisan organization such as National Rifle Association or Planned Parenthood or something along those lines?
Well, those organizations aren't providing a benefit to the employees. I mean, the Janus decision overturned a 40-year-old decision called Abood, which had, you know, and this had been the law of the land for decades and wasn't really a problem for anybody, that recognized that when you're represented by a union, you get benefits from that, and there was already an accommodation that, you know, people don't have to pay for the political advocacy, but they do have to pay for the costs of running the union, because the union is going to advocate for getting you, you know, higher salary and better benefits. And if nobody has to be part of the union in order to get the benefits of being in the union, then the union's not going to have any resources in order to fulfill its mission. And you know, as the dissent, I think, very eloquently argued in Janus, this used to be a state-by-state decision. You know, there were some states that said that you couldn't require this, and other states that said that you could, and the Supreme Court kind of took it out of everybody's hands and said, no, nobody can require this anymore. So from the standpoint of the dissent, it's taking that decision-making role out of the hands of state governments that are elected, and people have recourse to try and change the laws in their state if they don't like the way it affects issues like workplace governance. All right, you may not find that satisfying, but that's my answer.
Was there? Please, Jim, and then Andrew.
I assume you're familiar with Zephyr Teachout's relatively new book on corruption, where she argues that by any reasonable understanding of the 18th century framers' view of corruption, emoluments on the one hand and disproportionate amounts of money are corrupt. And that, of course, is a generation that used the First Amendment. So it's sort of a twofold question. Do you agree with her assessment, number one, that by any sort of reasonable late 18th century definition of corruption, both these things are corrupting undue amounts of money and emoluments, number one. And number two, how do you account then for a majority of the Supreme Court deciding against what seems to be your eminently sensible observation that if $3,000 is corrupting, for example, maybe 3 million would be corrupt. How do you account for the fact that smart people on the Supreme Court, the majority, do not see that?
Well, I must confess that I am familiar with Professor Teachow's book, but I have not read it. However, I am sympathetic to the general concept that both campaign finance and emoluments can be a cause of corruption. Obviously, I believe that money in politics it's not necessarily corrupting, but it certainly has that potential. And that has been an animating principle of my life's work. Why does the Supreme Court not agree with me? I don't know. I'm such a reasonable person. You know, I think that it's another symptom of polarization in politics, in Congress, at the FEC, and sadly on the courts. I have found, and this has been true for a long time, that when we have cases, and we do a fair amount of litigation, when people want to challenge the law, they have to sue us in order to do it. That is the vehicle for challenging some provision of the law. So we have litigators who are in court all the time on cases defending the constitutionality of the law. And I have found that I can get a pretty good feel for how the decision is going to come out as soon as I hear who the judge is and who's on the panel. You know, judges have some pretty well-defined ideas on campaign finance and the First Amendment. They're even those who purport to be deferential. You know, there's a new issue about Chevron deference and how long that's going to last, the deference to agency decision-making. But I have found that we don't get a lot of Chevron deference under the best of circumstances unless the judge kind of likes what we did in the first place, in which case we get a lot of Chevron deference. These are issues that really, there are strong disagreements in the legal community about. I think that more people in the country, and polling backs me up on this, share my point of view about the risks of corruption from money in politics. But there is, you know, a sincere belief by a number of lawyers that I know that the First Amendment is, when it says thou shalt make no law, they take that very seriously. They believe that money is speech. They believe that money facilitates speech, and you can't have speech without money in a modern, large country like this where you have to use mass media to communicate. If you're running a national campaign, you're not going to go around and shake the hands of 300 million people in this country. And they have a general deregulatory philosophy and a libertarian point of view that they just think regulation in general is a bad thing, and regulation of anything that affects speech is particularly a bad thing. You know, I think a lot of people have this as a sincere belief, including apparently 5 justices on the Supreme Court. I think some people who are in the political realm also think that this point of view advantages them politically. But I don't want to discount the sincerity of people who have a different point of view than I do, because I know people who really think this is the best thing for America. You just let everybody say as much as they want to say, and that's the best thing. And they kind of ignore the problem that I alluded to earlier, that we don't all have the resources to say as much as we would like to say.
So what do they say about the disproportionality, which is so obvious?
Yeah, it's just a feature of the system. They think that the cure would be worse than the disease. That, you know, to the extent that they acknowledge that there's a problem, they would probably say that any kind of limitation would be worse. That you know, there wouldn't be a principle that they would feel comfortable supporting. You know, you're asking me to defend a point of view that I don't hold, so I'm doing my best not to be dismissive and to be respectful of people who hold an alternative point of view, because that's one of the themes of, you know, my talk, that we should try to understand each other better.
Andrew?
Thank you for a most compelling talk. I've been delegated to ask a question on behalf of a colleague, and I will leave before the question is answered. I was wondering if you could speak a little more on the recent phenomenon of crowdfunding, or mass aggregations of small donations, particularly gathered electronically. What do you see as the potential promise of this, and
Well, I think that to the extent that one is concerned about money in politics, the corrupting influence of money in politics, because people who give a lot of money are going to have a disproportionate influence over what happens, both in the election and thereafter in policy outcomes, nobody's going to get that kind of influence from a $25 contribution. It's just not happening. I mean, honestly, I don't think you get that kind of access from a $700 contribution. And you know, Bernie Sanders famously ran a viable campaign for president. He gave Hillary a run for her money for the, literally for the nomination, raised, I think, $228 million. And as he kept telling us, his average contribution was $27. I mean, it's really hard for me to find the corrupting influence that could be levied by a campaign that is run on $27 contributions. And you know, you do see some campaigns that run have raised a huge amount of money. Interestingly enough, another candidate who raised a lot of money in small donations was Donald J. Trump, which I always found to be fascinating, that, you know, at a time when he was claiming he was going to fund his own campaign, that there were people out there that said, no, Donald, I don't want you to have to dig into your pocket for this. Let me give you my $25 so you don't have to spend the money. But, you know, people, it's skin in the game. You know, people who are energized around a campaign and they really like a candidate, they want to put their money where their mouth is. They want to throw a few dollars down. And I'm sure we've all gotten those endless solicitations that say, give us $3, give us $1, because candidates know that if you have skin in the game, if you are invested in a candidate, if you put down that $1 or $3, you are likely to give again. You are likely, much more likely to get out there and try and get your neighbors to vote, to get to volunteer for a campaign, because now you feel like, yeah, that's my candidate. I'm supporting that candidate. I put my money where my mouth is, and I'm going to go out there and try and get that person elected. So even if they don't seem to need the money.
Please.
What sort of efforts are there on equal time provisions that we used to have that have died and gone away, but are there any people who are influences that are trying to push for that?
Not that I'm aware of. I think that idea has sort of gone the way of history.
On the way to 90% tax that we had during the Eisenhower era?
Well, that among other things. Yeah, I don't see that coming back. And I think that, you know, once you get down to two major party candidates on the ballot, usually, unless it's one of these races where everybody looks at it and says, oh, that's just a no-hoper, there's no way that person's going to lose, in the tough races, the resources are usually there. I mean, they might not be 100% equally matched, but usually there are enough resources for each side to get their message out and to run a viable campaign. You don't need to have more money than the other guy in order to win your race. I mean, Hillary raised more money than Trump, and yet, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it that way. Clinton raised more money than Trump. I shouldn't call her by her first name and him by his last name. But she lost the election. You know, she did get more votes, but she lost the election. And she raised a lot more money than he did. It wasn't close. Now, of course, he had a lot of free media because the press couldn't resist following him around all the time. Sometimes the person who ends up with more money because everybody thinks that person's going to win. Money tends to follow success sometimes, doesn't always generate success. You need to, you know, because people want to have influence with the winner, or they want to support the winner, and once it becomes clear who the winner is, sometimes they can end up raising more money on the strength of that prediction. So it is not necessarily the case that the person who has more money is always going to win the election, as long as both sides have enough resources to get their message out. And I think where you see people who don't have enough resources, often at the primary level, where somebody new and different might be trying to get into the race and try and get the nomination, and they might not be able to raise the resources to run a competitive campaign, particularly against an incumbent. But, you know, that happens too. Incumbents get knocked off too.
Please follow.
You also have the issue too of publicly funded elections, for example, in Minnesota, where there's a process to semi-publicly fund elections. What potential do you see for things like that?
Well, of course, we used to have publicly funded elections, at least for the presidency, but the system became obsolete and nobody was really interested in fixing it. It just, the way the old public funding system, which still exists, but you know, only very minor candidates use it. You know, basically nobody who has a serious shot at it is going to use this system anymore. There was a matching fund in the primary, and then you get a general grant for the general election. And it used to be, you know, it was tens of millions of dollars, and you only had between the convention and the general, you know, sometimes a period of about 6 weeks to spend that much money. So people used to think, well, that's plenty of money. But now, you know, you're looking at $1 billion to run a national campaign for the presidency, and the public funding system has a cap on it. Now, the Supreme Court said you can't have a cap on spending, but you could have a carrot approach where in return for accepting public funding, you also accept spending. Now, the problem is the spending limits are unrealistically low given how much money people can raise these days through the private funding system, so none of the major candidates use it anymore. There are proposals to revive it, not only to revive it for the presidency, but also for all of Congress without a cap, you know, more along the lines of the New York City system where there would be a matching fund at a multiple match, but you wouldn't be capped in how much money that you could ultimately spend, because that just doesn't seem to work. But we would need a different Congress to get that enacted. I personally like the idea of public funding. Some people don't like it because they say, you know, why should we spend taxpayer dollars on something that when people can raise the money privately? But I think it is a less corrupt system, and you know, we ought to be willing to invest in our own democracy.
Further questions, please.
So dark money.
Dark money, bad.
Individuals are contributing to nonprofits anonymously. Who has the power? Does the FEC have the power to make the nonprofits disclose? And if not the FEC, who does?
Well, we could. The IRS, as you may know, used to collect this information confidentially, and now they've decided they're not even going to do that. And even though nobody ever actually saw that, it was of some comfort to people that there was some information somewhere. I mean, so maybe if you saw a ginormous contribution in rubles and you were, you know, some minion in the IRS, you might, you know, kind of raise a red flag, so to speak. But the way that the FEC could address dark money is there are a lot of groups that say they're not political committees. They don't disclose because they say they're not political committees. They say they're not political committees because they say they're issue groups. But a lot of the issue ads that they run are, you know, I know we don't like I know it when I see it as a rubric, but you know, nobody's really confused when they see these ads as to whether they are advocating for somebody's election or not, despite the fact that they don't actually say vote for or vote against. There was a group in North Carolina, keep mentioning North Carolina, lots of interesting things happen in North Carolina, in I think the 2014 cycle, called Carolina Rising. They raised $5 million. We think it came from basically one big donor, and they spent most of the money on advertising, running positive ads, which was a little bit unusual because usually these groups run the negative ads, and so the candidate doesn't have to take responsibility for being the bad guy and the nasty person. But they ran, in particular, 2 ads that I recall that were just so warm and fuzzy about this candidate. I wanted to vote for him after I saw it. It was just lovely. And they claimed that these were not election ads, these were issue ads. Now, this was a new variant. So we had seen single candidate super PACs. Those were political committees that were raising these unlimited funds to advocate for a particular candidate. But this was a single candidate 501c4 organization, which ought to be impossible because the whole idea of a 501c4 organization is that they are not designed to influence the election. That's not their primary purpose. And yet, all this group did was to run positive ads about this one particular candidate for Senate in North Carolina. And on election night, the head of this organization was videoed by the local news crew in the campaign headquarters of the winning candidate, wearing a campaign hat for that person and cheering, "We did it, $5 million, and we did it." And then when a complaint was filed, my colleagues said, well, why would you think that was an organization that was dedicated to influence the election? We don't see any reason to investigate that. So we could adopt a more realistic standard for some of these 501c4 groups that are claiming not to be political committees, but I often see groups that I think really ought to be registered as political committees, and if they were registered as political committees, then they would have to disclose their donors.
Does the FEC have any clout to make that happen, or no? To make the organizations file as?
If we said they were a political committee, then yeah, we could make them file. You know, people file, the way it would work is somebody would file a complaint and we would say, why, yes, you are a political committee. And as a result of that, you need to register with the FEC and tell us who your donors are, and then we'll put it up on the web so everybody can see. We could totally do that. This is within our authority.
But it's not going to happen.
It is not apparently within our political will. You know, it's an evenly divided body, and some of us are less committed to seeing this transparency than others.
Oh, please.
I'm currently working on a research project over political disclosure over political ads
Mm-hmm.
and how receptive voters are to that. And I was wondering if you had any commentary just in general over that particular field or concerns and solutions for that issue that people are perceiving.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what, I mean, that's like what I do is political disclosure, political ads. So that could be a very long conversation. I am generally pro disclosure of who's behind political ads, and I think that it does make a difference to how you perceive the message. I mean, part of the reason why, you know, back in 1976, in the Buckley decision, the Supreme Court said that independent spending couldn't be limited. So, you know, all these billionaires could have been running ads all along. What changed in Citizens United was the ability of these folks to get together and pool their resources behind groups that had these anodyne names, like, you know, Americans for America Tomorrow. What was the Stephen Colbert group? America's for a Better Tomorrow. Yeah. If you want a great primer on campaign finance law, go look up the old Stephen Colbert routines that he did with Trevor Potter, a former FEC commissioner, because they're really very entertaining and actually quite good and true to the law. But it was the advent of these groups that really made this phenomenon explode, because why would you listen to an ad that carried as its disclaimer, paid for by John Jones? Who cares what John Jones thinks? But when it's paid for by, you know, Grassroots America, well, now it sounds like there's a whole bunch of citizens out there who believe this. And, you know, I'm pretty skeptical because I know this stuff, but I think a lot of people, you know, and I think there's some research out there that people are surprisingly amenable to listening to groups like this, and they think it really is a group of grassroots citizens. They just don't realize who's behind this group. Of course, they can't know exactly who's behind this group because nobody tells you.
We have time for one more question.
Back on the dark money. California and New York require disclosure of those for the 501c4s and 3s if it is involving election, of the understanding. And is that only for non-federal elections, or?
Well, whatever is going on in California and New York, that would be for non-federal elections because they don't have jurisdiction. We have exclusive jurisdiction over the federal elections. There are a variety of measures at the state level that are, some of them stronger, some of them weaker than the ones at the federal level. Virginia, for example, has no limits on any kind of contributions. And California does have strong disclosure rules, stronger than we have. Maryland also recently, I think, adopted some stronger disclosure rules, particularly for digital ads. So it varies state by state. Like I said, sometimes if something kind of catches on at the state level and a number of states adopt it, it creates a momentum for federal action. Sure you don't want to give this guy a chance to ask his question? He was waiting very patiently.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see.
No, recently
Please.
we've seen very disturbing reports out of the state of Georgia where the Secretary of State, who is also the Republican gubernatorial candidate, has disenfranchised up to 340,000 individuals in the state, predominantly minority individuals, especially in the African American community. What exactly can be done about that situation? You know, for instance, we had a voter ID law here in the state of Pennsylvania where it was successfully challenged in court, like you said, but that would be a policy change or directive that would come from the Secretary of State himself. So,
I mean, things like that can be challenged in court. I think that I think in Pennsylvania it was based on the state constitution, which I think that was, you know, state constitutions can be amended. Sometimes they can be amended in good ways and sometimes they can be amended in bad ways. As I told you, I think it's North Carolina where they're trying to mandate voter IDs as part of the state constitution because it got struck down before. So there could be citizen action in Georgia to try and strengthen protections for voting. People could vote for, obviously they will have the opportunity to vote for a new Secretary of State because the current Secretary of State is running for governor. And, you know, the citizens of Georgia should quiz that candidate closely on what their views are on empowering different voting groups. As I said before, I think it's really despicable for anyone to try and limit the voting of any particular population in their state. You know, the way to succeed ought to be to appeal to the voters, not to try and restrict the voters. And if you can't do that, then there's something wrong with your platform.
I think on that conclusive note, thank you to Commissioner Weintraub.
Thank you all for coming.